Okay, so, one of my passions is gambling in all its forms, and that's association with my profession, which is trying to understand risk and uncertainty. So let me start out by talking about God, Church of England, and God's work. So, I don't know how many of you know this, but in 2002, Church of England lost £400 million in their pensions. In 2009, they lost half their pension. So some of the priests are going to go hungry. If you look at this, I'm not sure what comes to your mind, but it seems to me that at least some people from the finance industry are surely going to help. Now, there is no novelty in pointing out the consequences of the current crisis. There is no novelty in pointing out what are the reasons for the current crisis. But still, I think it's extremely important to keep on reminding ourselves of the mind-boggling numbers involved. I mean, there was enormous destruction of wealth. Now, when you look at something like this, a very common, frequent remark is, look, this is a black swan. Now, what is a black swan? This is a term made popular by the famous author Nassim Taleb, who defined black swan as an extremely rare event with disproportionately large consequences, and an event we don't even imagine a priori. So if we ask that in this context, my answer would be a resounding no. It has happened before, it will happen again, it will happen suddenly, and consequences could probably be larger. Here are some of the quotes. Before that, let me show you some of the data related to this. This is the '07 bubble. We're suffering through it now. Before that was the 1966 bubble. Suffered through that in the mid-'80s. Before that, the famous '29 bubble. Suffered through that in the 1930s and so on. And there are more examples. I've just shown you a sample. Here are some quotes related to these. This is a senior Chinese government official. I was asked to remove the photograph. Asked in 2007, is there a bubble in the Chinese market? He basically said financial markets are like champagne. If there are no bubbles, no one will drink them. This is Alan Greenspan, March 2009, saying we've never been able to model successfully the transition from euphoria to fear. Basically admitting that these things happen suddenly. This is Dr. Doom, basically saying there'll be another burst. I don't think he has the capability to predict when it'll happen. He'll keep on saying it until it happens. But he's right in the sense that it will happen again at some point. Now, once again, this is an example of what we might call the physics envy in many socioeconomics models, where often we carelessly assume that more mathematically sophisticated our models, the better we can measure things, the better we can control them, and so on, which actually can lead to some serious mismanagement of risk, misunderstanding of uncertainty, and so on. Here's another view to all this risk, uncertainty, judgments, which actually I sympathize with quite a bit. Here Calvin is saying the more you know, the harder it is to take decisive action. Once you become informed, you start seeing complexities and shades of grey. You realize that nothing is as clear and simple as it first appears. Ultimately, knowledge is paralyzing, and being a man of action, I can't afford to take that risk. I have a lot of sympathy for this view. But the point is, when Church of England is involved, when stakes are high, we just have to learn to be a little bit more careful. Now, there's a lot of work that has been done in this area in the wide academic community. We've done a lot of it at NCA too. And we recently published a book. I published this with two co-authors. One is Spiros Makridakis. He's Greek. He's a very famous forecasting guru. It is very difficult to find a single textbook on forecasting which doesn't reference his work in one way or another. The other person is a very famous psychologist from University of Chicago. He's one of the founders of behavioral decision theory. The origin of this work actually goes back to the late 70s when Spiros was a new young professor at NCA. He had just been trained in statistical forecasting, PhD from NYU in the US, came to NCA in Fontainebleau, France. In his interaction with businesses, he was a bit surprised to find that businesses were using very naive models for forecasting. So he took it upon himself to convince them to use more sophisticated models. In order to do that, he did a series of empirical forecasting studies, where different models were used to make forecasts about different things anywhere from 6 months to 2 years ahead, and the forecasts were compared with the actual outcome. To his horror, he found that simple, naive models did much better than complex models. So at first, academics accused him of not using the models correctly, so he repeated these competitions all the way up to year 2000, inviting some of the best in the world practitioners and academics to do the forecasting themselves, and yet again he found the same results. So some of the big bullet points from his work are that complex models can fit the past data well, but don't necessarily predict the future well. Simple models, on the other hand, might not fit the past data well, but do better than complex models in predicting the future. Averaging across more than one model seems to do well, but the problem here is even though simple models do better than complex models, they're still far from being useful in any practical way in terms of predicting the future. Spiros, who had worked 40 years in this area, got completely depressed. He retired, lives on a Greek island, has become a philosopher. If you talk to him, his most common phrase is, "What's the point?" You look at all this, a natural question that should come to our mind is if all these complex models, if all the statistical forecasting is not working, perhaps we should find ways to leverage human judgment more. After all, there's a lot of untapped contextual knowledge in people, there's experience and so on. Now, this area of human judgment has blossomed over the last 30 to 40 years. A tradition started by Kahneman and Tversky, but now taken up by sociologists, psychologists. Now neuroscience is coming into play and so on. So there's a lot of work in this area. And until now, unfortunately, the news is not very good. As the title of this book says, we tend to be predictably irrational. So one of the main findings in this area is that irrespective of our context, gender, race, nationality, training, and so on, when we are making judgments, especially when we are dealing with risk and uncertainty, we tend to fall into some very systematic traps. Now, one of the big overarching psychological phenomena that affects us all, that we are very susceptible to, is what we call illusion of control. So the world is not as simple as I'm going to portray it here, but just for ease of exposition, think of an environment where outcome depends on your ability or your effort. You work harder, you get more. You're more able, you get more. Contrast that with an environment where the outcome depends on pure chance, like a roulette wheel in Marina Bay Sands. And then we make assumptions about that environment. It is rarely, actually, we make correct assumptions. And if things depend on our ability and effort, and we assume it depends on chance, psychologists would call it fatalism. The opposite psychological state of this is what we call illusion of control, when things actually depend on chance, and we assume no, they depend on our skill, on our effort. And casinos exploit that a lot. If I have time, I'll give you examples. Now, if you look at human beings, in evolutionary terms, irrespective of culture, institutions, and so on, we've placed a very high cost on fatalism. For good reasons. If it hadn't been that, we wouldn't have made all the progress we've made in science, technology, economic prosperity, medicine, and so on. However, in trying to avoid fatalism, we often go much too far and we fall into this trap of illusion of control. So what? It has consequences. And before I share some of those with you, just a footnote that it is not just for people who do the intuition stuff or you use subjective judgment. Whether you're the rational type, you're the intuitive type, you're the blinking type, illusion of control can be a very strong overarching phenomenon. Now, what we try to show is that in socioeconomic domains, we very often fall into this trap. What happens? We underestimate uncertainty. We underestimate the role of chance. We overestimate our ability to predict the future with all kinds of strong consequences on risk, our understanding of uncertainty, and so on. And the counter-argument is that if we recognize what we don't control, we don't try and control it, you can actually attain more beneficial outcomes. And I'm going to try to show you a few examples. Now, I'm not sure how many of you do annual health checkups. Can I see a shake? You're still all very young, but this number will increase a few years down the road. As we see more and more data, we don't know whether it's good news or bad news. It appears, as we see more and more data, that these annual health checkups could be quite useless. Now, let me show you an example. You go to a doctor in Mount Elizabeth, Glen Eagles, or some other hospital. What is the doctor going to tell you? They're going to point to 8 major risk factors. They're going to say, control your cholesterol, control your blood pressure, exercise, don't get too fat, eat fruits and vegetables, exercise, don't smoke, don't drink, and don't work in coal mines. These 8 major risk factors. Now, what if your cholesterol is 230? There'll be pressure on you and the doctor to start you on some cholesterol-lowering medicine, like Lipitor. If you start that, you have to take it for the rest of your life. If your blood pressure is 135/95 on 3 consecutive occasions, there'll be pressure on doctor to put you on some hypertension drugs like Koza, you take it for the rest of your life. Basically, we have these magical thresholds, like 200 for cholesterol, like 120/80 for blood pressure. We take all kinds of medications, and we try to keep it all below those numbers. Now, Harvard Institute of Public Health actually did a very interesting study, which was again done by also another medical journal. They found that taking all these 8 major risk factors together explains only 20% of the variation in life expectancy. 80% is completely unexplained. We don't know why some people live longer, why some people live less. Another somewhat naive way of interpreting this is, if you give up smoking, you give up drinking, you exercise 6 times a week, you drink orange juice 5 times a day, you eat only fruits and vegetables, and you don't get out of your house, maybe on an average you live 4 years longer. My Greek co-author, who's 67 years old, is completely obsessed with this. He found this on the internet, possible side effects, and the question he's asking is, do I want to give up sex for the rest of my life to live 6 months longer? Kind of a cost of illusion of control. A very recent study, one of the most prestigious journals in medicine, basically shows that the number of deaths from prostate cancer is actually higher for men who were screened with PSA than for unscreened men. The false positive rates of some of these tests are as high as 75%, meaning that these tests are not only useless, but can actually be harmful because of overdiagnosis and overtreatment. Now, this is a very difficult message to get, and it is often misunderstood. It is not that medicine is not useful. It is not that doctors are not smart. They're incredibly dedicated and very, very smart people. The idea here is not to fall into this trap of illusion of control, which means not to overestimate the benefits, not to underestimate the side effects, not to overestimate the certainty of medicine, to understand that there's a lot which is unexplained, and to focus on evidence-based medicine, which has some very serious implication at an individual level, but also at a social level. Let me take another example. This is an area I've started finding a bit boring because it is too easy to pick upon. It's finance. This is the United States market, 1987 to year 2000. I'm watching this. So I decide I'm going to write a book. So I write a book called Dow 36,000. How do I do that? I basically take the data and I extrapolate it until it reaches 36,000. It sells in train stations, airports, bookshops, Financial Times. You get invited to CNBC, TV all the time. Millions of dollars, someone's watching it. So they said, okay, I'm going to write Dow 40,000. Let's expand it a little bit more. Same thing happens, millions of copies, lots of money everywhere. Another person in the same year is watching this, saying, okay, how can I take a leap ahead? Let me go to Dow 100,000. This is the kind of nonsense you see very often in terms of making predictions, in terms of making forecasting. A book came out in 2005 by The Real Estate Boom Will Not Bust Ever, Ever Again. This is in California, and we all know what's happened. Now here's an example of cost of illusion of control. The other side of the story. And again, you can take any time window. I'm taking a time window which has been very extensively studied by thousands and thousands of researchers. So this is 1984 to 2002, a period of 18 years. Suppose you put your money in an ETF or an index fund which tracks the S&P 500 and you go to sleep for 18 years. You don't look at it, you don't control it, you do nothing. You would have made on an average of 13% return per year. This is the average return for an active mutual fund manager underperforming the market, basically saying you should not put your money in mutual funds. These are the people we feel bad about. These are the retail investors into mutual funds, only an average return of 3%. Because these are people who buy high and sell low. It's 2007, everything is going up, everyone's buying BMWs, they're afraid of being left behind, so they buy into the market. It's 2009, things are dropping, they get scared, so they sell. So buying high, selling low. Here's an example where you actually give up control, you have a more beneficial outcome. Suppose your 3-year kid asks you, Mommy, what's an optimal portfolio? What are you doing on this online brokerage account at 3 in the morning? You say, look, baby, we have a certain amount of wealth. We're going to take that wealth and divide it among a number of assets to maximize returns to ourselves. But how should we do that? There's an optimal theory we learned in business schools. There are actually 14 of them. Most of these theories use some of the best mathematics known to humankind. These are very, very smart problems. They're very interesting to work on and so on. They're actually very, very good. Now what we're going to do is take each one of these modern portfolio theories and compare it to a simple naive rule, which is 1/n rule. You have $100,000, you have 10 assets available, you divide equally among those 10 assets. Real estate, large cap, small cap, emerging markets, and so on. No fancy calculations, no fancy estimations, and so on. Maybe once a year you rebalance. You sell what's gone up, you buy into what's gone down to keep it all equal. If you do that, not only none of those 14 theories consistently outperform this rule often does the best. What does that mean? Not that you should use this rule, but that those 14 theories are quite useless in real life. Business schools have been part of the problem. We have a lot of Pied Pipers of management, which say follow me. It's one of the most well-selling books. Millions of copies is based on 32 best-run firms. If you look at these firms, half of those are in deep trouble. A predictive power no better than a coin toss. Now this is another book which came out in 1994, based on 18 firms, half in trouble, 6 in very, very deep trouble. Now, same thing goes to happiness. Now if you think about, can we predict who will be happy, who will not be happy? These are very, very difficult questions to answer. So let me first try and explain to you why there are such serious limits to predictability. After all, very, very smart people work in finance, there are a lot of resources in medicine and so on. In a book, we have a story. And to explain that, we didn't want to stereotype nationalities, but we had to pick one, so we picked a Swiss German. So think of a Swiss German named Klaus. He's an investment banker, lives on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, a complete control freak. Doesn't like any surprises. So he takes the subway every day from home to office, doesn't want to reach too late, doesn't want to reach too early. So he starts noting down in a book how much time it takes him every day to go from home to office. He does it for 40 days, he gets very excited because the data is very well behaved. It looks like a nice bell-shaped curve that he learned in a business school. So now he can estimate on an average I can be in office 45 minutes, 99% of the time I can be in my office between 40 and 50 minutes and so on. Taking his family for vacation to Phuket in Thailand, starts planning 10 months in advance, calls airlines 6 months before time. He's heard Singapore Airlines is one of the safest, so insists on Singapore Airlines and wants seats on top of the wings because in a conversation he heard that in times of crash landing that's somewhat safer. They reach Phuket, takes family for elephant rides and makes everyone wear helmets, including his 2-year-old kid. One morning, family is sleeping, he's walking on the beach. Sun is beaming down on him. He gets worried he's going to get skin cancer. So he sits under a tree to put sun lotion on his body, and while he's doing that, a coconut drops on his head and he dies. What is the broad point we're trying to flush out is there are two types of uncertainty. One is what we call subway uncertainty, which can be modeled, which can be quantified. What will be the demand for electricity 2 days from now between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. We can predict it extremely well. On the other hand, you have this coconut uncertainty, which is difficult, if not impossible, to model. Will there be another asset bubble? The answer is yes, but when, where, in what form, we don't know how to do that. And most real-life situations are a mixture of the two. We create models, we capture the subway uncertainty, we do judgments, we capture the subway uncertainty. Coconut uncertainty remains unexplained, and hence we consistently underestimate risk, uncertainty, and overestimate our ability to predict. Stop. So basically these are the two types of uncertainty. There are lots of examples here, and the main point here is, I'll just go to the last slide. Sorry. That you have to use an integrative approach in the following sense, that you take any theory or judgments, decision making, you can classify them into one of two broad categories, rational approach or the behavioral approach, and the only way forward is to try and put them together and make progress forward, taking into account things like what Gino was talking about, what Jeffrey was talking about, and some of the rational traditions. Thank you very much.